A woman was kicked off a flight for being too big, humiliated in front of strangers. The airline thought it was just another routine removal until Shaquille O'Neal spoke up. What they didn't realize? The CEO was watching, and this flight was about to change everything. Power, justice, and an industry-shaking twist. This is the story they never saw coming. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The airport buzzed with the usual chaos, people dragging suitcases, last-minute announcements crackling over the intercom, and the occasional frustrated traveler arguing over a missed connection. Shaquille O'Neal, towering over the crowd yet moving with an effortless grace, navigated through the terminal with a quiet ease. Dressed casually in a hoodie and joggers, he preferred keeping things simple when he traveled. No bodyguards, no fanfare. Just a man heading to his next destination. Shaq had long learned that money and fame didn't change who he was at his core. Despite his towering presence and legendary status, he was just a man who valued kindness above all else. He avoided the special treatment that came with his name, preferring to experience the world as an ordinary traveler. Today was no different. He had booked a first-class seat but insisted on handling his own luggage, making his way to the boarding gate without drawing unnecessary attention. As he stepped onto the plane, the familiar scent of leather seats and recycled air greeted him. He found his seat near the window and settled in, stretching his legs. A peaceful flight, that's all he wanted. No cameras, no interviews, no unnecessary conversations. Just a few quiet hours in the sky before he landed at his next destination. The flight attendants moved through the aisle with practiced efficiency, welcoming passengers, helping them stow their luggage, and ensuring everything was in order. The atmosphere was calm, routine. That was until the last passenger walked in. Shaq's eyes drifted toward the front of the cabin as a woman entered, her presence marked not by noise, but by the uneasy energy that suddenly filled the space. She was tall and broad-shouldered, a full-figured woman dressed in a comfortable but well-fitted travel outfit. She carried herself with quiet dignity, but there was something else, a self-consciousness, a carefulness in how she moved, as if she were trying to shrink herself to take up less space. She clutched her boarding pass in one hand, her purse in the other, and scanned the numbers on the seats, her expression shifting between focus and discomfort. As she stepped forward, the flight attendants exchanged glances. It was quick, subtle, something only an observant person would catch. But Shaq saw it, and then it happened. One of the flight attendants, a blonde woman with a polished uniform and a tone dripping with artificial politeness, stepped forward, stopping the woman in her tracks. "Ma'am, I need you to step aside for a moment," she said. The woman hesitated, confusion flashing across her face. "I have a seat," she said, holding up her boarding pass. The flight attendant's smile tightened. "I understand, but we need to discuss a seating arrangement. Please step aside." A few heads turned. Passengers in first class exchanged knowing looks, some uncomfortable, some indifferent, a few watching with thinly veiled curiosity. Shaq remained silent, but his focus sharpened. The woman, her name, as Shaq would later learn, was Harper Sterling, hesitated before stepping slightly to the side, her eyes flickering toward the row of seats ahead. She wasn't causing a scene. She wasn't arguing. She was simply waiting, trying to understand what was happening. But Shaq had seen this before. He had witnessed moments like this too many times, when a person wasn't being openly insulted, but they were being made to feel like they didn't belong. The way the attendant's voice had softened, not with kindness, but with the forced patience of someone tolerating an inconvenience. The way passengers avoided looking directly at Harper, pretending not to notice. "Ma'am," the flight attendant continued, lowering her voice but not enough to hide her words from those nearby. "Our policy states that passengers who cannot comfortably fit in a single seat may be required to purchase an additional one for safety reasons." Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. Harper's posture stiffened. Her jaw tightened just slightly, but her eyes betrayed the sharp sting of humiliation. She opened her mouth as if to respond, then closed it again, forcing herself to breathe through the moment. "I bought a ticket," she said, her voice steady but tinged with something unspoken. A quiet plea to not be made into a spectacle. Yes, but unfortunately, we may need to make alternative arrangements. The flight attendant's smile never wavered, but the message was clear. Shaq felt something deep in his chest tighten. Anger, not the loud, explosive kind, but the quiet, simmering rage that settled into his bones. He knew what was happening here. He had spent years seeing discrimination dressed up as policy. Harper wasn't being removed for safety reasons. She was being removed because she didn't fit into a narrow, unspoken standard of what a first-class passenger was supposed to look like. Shaq glanced around. A few passengers shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Others simply looked away, pretending this moment wasn't unfolding right in front of them. And then, as if to make matters worse, the flight attendant raised her voice just slightly, ensuring everyone heard her next words. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you will need to deplane." The words hung in the air like a slap. A few gasps, a few murmurs. Someone a few rows back sighed in irritation, as if this delay was nothing more than an inconvenience. Harper closed her eyes for a fraction of a second before opening them again, her expression blank, not because she wasn't feeling anything, but because she had learned to hide it. Shaq exhaled slowly, then spoke. "She can have my seat." His voice, deep and unmistakable, cut through the tension like a knife. The flight attendant turned sharply, her expression shifting the second she recognized him. Her professional mask faltered just slightly, a flicker of hesitation flashing in her eyes. "Mr. O'Neal," she started, a different tone creeping into her voice now, one bordering on nervousness. You said the issue was space, right?" Shaq leaned back in his seat, his expression calm but his presence unshakable. "Then take my seat. First class, plenty of room." Problem solved. A ripple of whispers spread through the cabin. Passengers who had been silent before were now watching intently. The flight attendant hesitated. This wasn't part of the script. She had expected the woman to quietly leave, not for a 7'1" millionaire to intervene. "Sir, it's not that simple." "Seems simple to me," Shaq said, his voice level. "She stays or I walk off this plane with her." That did it. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. A man from a few rows back spoke up, his voice firm. "Yeah, what's the issue? She paid for her seat." Another woman added, "This isn't right. She deserves to fly like the rest of us." The flight attendant's face flushed slightly, her earlier confidence cracking. This was spiraling out of control, and she knew it. Shaq didn't move, didn't raise his voice, didn't argue. He simply waited. And then, the decision was made. A second flight attendant whispered something to the first, and just like that, the tone shifted. "Of course, there's no need to remove anyone," the first attendant finally said, her smile strained. "It seems we can accommodate after all." Shaq didn't respond, but the message was clear. Harper's eyes flickered toward him, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief in her gaze. She didn't say anything, not yet. But she didn't have to. She took her seat. The doors closed, and the flight took off. Shaq leaned back in his chair, staring out the window as the plane lifted into the sky. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Harper Sterling had spent her life standing up to unfairness. As a school teacher, she had taught her students to challenge prejudice, to embrace differences, and to never let the world dictate their worth. Yet sitting here at 30,000 feet, her hands gripping the armrests, she had never felt so small. The plane was in the air now, but the tension from earlier still clung to the cabin like thick humidity. The passengers had settled in, shifting their focus back to their in-flight entertainment or quiet conversations. But Harper? She sat frozen, her body tense, her breathing slow and controlled, trying to make herself invisible. She had tried to move past what had happened at boarding, the humiliating way she had been singled out, the way the flight attendant had spoken to her as if she were an inconvenience rather than a paying customer. But the sting of it still burned under her skin. She could feel the glances, the stolen looks from other passengers, some curious, some indifferent, and some laced with thinly veiled judgment. And then, as if to make sure she wouldn't forget what had just happened, the flight attendant, the same one who had tried to remove her from the plane, reappeared. "Ma'am," she said, her voice syrupy but firm. "I need to check with you one more time about the seating situation." Harper looked up slowly, feeling a wave of exhaustion press down on her. I already told you. I paid for my seat. The attendant sighed, tilting her head in a way that feigned sympathy, but dripped with condescension. I understand, but our airline has certain policies when it comes to passenger comfort. We have to ensure that everyone in your row has adequate space. I am in my seat, Harper interrupted, keeping her voice measured. I am not bothering anyone. I am not breaking any rules. The attendant gave a tight, polished smile, as if she were dealing with a difficult child rather than a grown woman. Passengers must be able to fit within the seat dimensions comfortably. If that's not possible, the protocol is to purchase an additional seat. A few people around them had stopped pretending not to listen. A woman a row ahead shifted uncomfortably, adjusting her earbuds as if trying to decide whether she wanted to be part of this moment or not. Harper swallowed. Her throat felt dry. I didn't have an issue with the seat when I sat down, she said, her voice softer now but firm. I'm buckled in. I'm not in anyone's way. I bought one ticket because I needed one seat. The flight was full. I had no option to buy another seat even if I wanted to. The flight attendant's smile never wavered, but her tone sharpened. I understand, ma'am, but we have other passengers to consider. Harper stiffened. The words other passengers were a weighty thing. It meant, you don't belong here. You are making this uncomfortable for others. You are the problem. She glanced to the side. The man sitting next to her, an older businessman in a crisp button-up, shifted slightly but said nothing. He wasn't uncomfortable. He wasn't crushed or squeezed or struggling for space. He was perfectly fine. Harper looked back up at the flight attendant. I'm not moving. The air changed. For a split second, the attendant's polished mask cracked. She hadn't expected resistance. Not here. Not after everything that had happened during boarding. But she quickly recovered, straightening her posture as if she were gearing up for battle. That's your choice, she said smoothly. Too smoothly. Then, after a calculated pause, she added, but we might have to escalate this situation if it becomes a safety issue. Passengers shifted in their seats. A few exchanged nervous glances. Shaq had been quiet, watching, his massive frame relaxed, but his eyes sharp. He had seen this before, not just today, but in life. It was the same kind of veiled prejudice masked as policy that had affected people like him in different ways. It wasn't about rules. It was about who they wanted in these seats and who they didn't. His jaw tightened. He could feel the slow, simmering burn of anger in his chest. Not the kind that made people yell, the kind that made people act. The flight attendant turned, as if she was about to leave, but she wasn't done. Not yet. She leaned slightly toward the older businessman next to Harper, and, in a calculated move, spoke over Harper instead of to her. Sir, are you comfortable? Harper felt her face flush hot with humiliation. The businessman hesitated, clearly caught off guard, and fumbled for an answer. Yeah, I guess. It wasn't enough. The flight attendant's smile thinned. I just want to be sure. If at any point this becomes an issue for your space, please let us know. Harper exhaled slowly, trying to steady her hands. This wasn't concern. This was a performance, a way to make her feel small in front of everyone. She gritted her teeth, swallowing back the words she wanted to say. And then, Shaq moved. The subtle shift of his massive frame was impossible to ignore. The seat creaked slightly under his weight as he leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, his presence suddenly commanding the space around him. His voice was calm, measured, but undeniable. She's good. The flight attendant turned to him sharply. For the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Shaq didn't blink, didn't raise his voice, didn't challenge her outright. But his presence alone sent a clear message. This moment was being watched. More than that, it wasn't just her word against a defenseless passenger anymore. It was her word against his. A shift rippled through the cabin. The flight attendant hesitated. She knew who Shaquille O'Neal was. Everyone did. And more importantly, she knew how this would look if she pushed any further. A long, silent beat passed. And then, with a forced smile, She straightened. Of course. If there's anything either of you need, let us know. She turned on her heel and walked away, disappearing toward the front of the plane. Harper exhaled, her hands still trembling slightly on the armrests. She wasn't sure if she had won anything. Maybe she had just delayed the inevitable. But then, a quiet voice beside her. You good? She turned her head slightly, looking at Shaq. His tone was casual, almost effortless, but there was a weight behind it, a meaning. Harper blinked, the tightness in her throat suddenly unbearable. Yeah, she whispered. I'm good. And for the first time since she had stepped onto this plane, she almost believed it. The tension in the cabin was thick, an unspoken battle between what was right and what was happening. Harper Sterling sat still, her face calm, but Shaq could see the exhaustion in her posture. She had fought enough battles, in her life, to know when she was expected to surrender. But not today. The flight attendant, the same one who had already embarrassed Harper twice, wasn't done yet. Her polished demeanor hadn't cracked completely, but there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes as she looked toward Shaq. She knew who he was. Everyone did. The quiet murmurs around the cabin confirmed it. People recognized him now, the low whispers traveling from one row to the next. But Shaq wasn't interested in being recognized. He wasn't here as a celebrity. He was here as a man who had just seen something deeply wrong, and he wasn't about to let it slide. He exhaled, his massive frame shifting slightly in his seat before he finally spoke. If space is the problem, he said, his deep voice steady, controlled but loud enough for everyone to hear, she can have my seat. Silence. The kind of silence that freezes the air and makes time stretch unnaturally long, the kind that demands attention. The flight attendant blinked, her composure slipping for the first time. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She hadn't expected this. A few passengers looked between Shaq and Harper, their expressions ranging from surprise to uneasy realization. Some had been ignoring the situation, hoping it would disappear on its own. But now, Shaquille O'Neal had just dragged it into the light. I'm sorry, Mr. O'Neal, the flight attendant stammered, finding her voice again, but we have airline policies to follow. Shaq didn't blink. Seems like the only policy here is treating people differently. A soft gasp from somewhere in the back. A man in the aisle seat 2 rows ahead shifted uncomfortably, suddenly interested in the in-flight magazine he had been ignoring. Shaq leaned forward slightly, his expression calm but unyielding. She's in her seat. She's not bothering anyone. She's not breaking any rules. So what exactly is the problem? The flight attendant forced a smile, but the strain behind it was obvious. As I mentioned before, sir, passengers must be seated comfortably, without encroaching on others' space. It's about the safety and comfort of everyone on board. Shaq's brow furrowed slightly, his eyes locked onto hers. She's not uncomfortable. The guy sitting next to her isn't uncomfortable. You're the only one making this uncomfortable. More whispers. A man a few rows back nodded slightly, as if just now realizing what had been bothering him about this whole thing. The flight attendant straightened, clearly realizing she was losing control of the situation. Her voice, once smooth and patronizing, now carried a hint of defensiveness. Sir, we're simply following procedure. Shaq cut her off. Nah, you're hiding behind procedure. That did it. The power dynamic in the cabin shifted. Passengers were no longer just silent observers. A woman 2 rows back, dressed in business casual, spoke up for the first time. She's right. What's the issue here? She paid for a seat like the rest of us. A younger man, maybe in his 20s, glanced up from his phone. Yeah, this doesn't make sense. If she was too big for the seat, they wouldn't have sold it to her in the first place. More voices, low but growing, began to ripple through the plane. And then, like a final desperate grasp for authority, the flight attendant made a call she would soon regret. She pressed the button on her intercom, her voice tightly controlled. I need security at the front cabin. The air froze. Shaq's expression didn't change, but Harper inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around the armrests. Security? For what? A few passengers shifted in their seats, suddenly tense. They had all seen enough viral videos to know how this could go. Harper glanced at Shaq, And for the first time, he saw something in her eyes that made his chest tighten. Not just anger, not just exhaustion. Fear. A fear she probably knew all too well. A fear of what happens when people in power decide that someone doesn't belong. Shaq had seen that fear before, and he was done watching it play out. So he moved, not aggressively, not in a way that would give security any excuse to escalate things, but in a way that couldn't be ignored. He stood, his full 7 feet 1 inch frame unfolding, casting a shadow over the first-class cabin. The murmurs stopped. The flight attendant took half a step back before she caught herself, clearing her throat. Shaq's voice was quiet now, but strong enough to shake the air itself. "You called security for what?" His tone was controlled, but there was an unmistakable warning underneath it. The flight attendant hesitated. The passengers were watching. No, they were judging. She had expected compliance. She had expected quiet surrender. But now, she was facing something entirely different. Shaq exhaled slowly. "If security's coming, I'll be right here waiting. I want to hear them say out loud why they're kicking a woman off a flight she paid for." Harper turned slightly, watching him, her grip on the armrest loosening just a bit. The flight attendant opened her mouth, but no words came out. The balance of power had shifted entirely. The security officers, 2 uniformed men with stiff postures, finally arrived, stepping into the first-class section. They looked around, assessing the situation. They had likely been told they were coming to handle an unruly passenger. Instead, they were faced with Shaquille O'Neal. One of them, a middle-aged man with a shaved head, glanced at the flight attendant, waiting for an explanation. The whole plane was silent. The flight attendant's throat bobbed slightly. She was cornered now. If she told security to remove Harper, she risked the backlash of a lifetime. If she backed down, she risked admitting she was wrong. For the first time, her voice wavered slightly. "There doesn't seem to be a disturbance," she said finally, her professional mask slipping just enough for Shaq to see the frustration underneath. Security hesitated. One of the officers glanced at Shaq, then at Harper. He seemed to realize there was nothing to act on. "Are there any further issues here?" the older officer asked, his tone flat, neutral. Shaq let the moment stretch. Then, with a slow shake of his head, he rumbled, "Nope." The security officers exchanged a look before stepping back. "Then enjoy your flight." And with that, they walked away. The flight attendant's face flushed red, but she knew she had lost. Shaq sat back down, the tension in the air still crackling, but shifting into something new. Not fear, not discomfort. Power. Passengers exchanged glances, some relieved, some simply in awe of what had just happened. A few pulled out their phones, already typing. Harper let out a slow breath. Shaq didn't look at her, but he felt her shoulders relax slightly beside him. And somewhere deep inside him, he knew. This wasn't over. Harper Sterling's hands gripped the armrests, her knuckles turning white. She could feel her pulse hammering in her ears, her breath coming in controlled, measured inhales. She refused to cry. Not here, not now. Not in front of people who had already decided she was the problem. She had done nothing wrong. And yet, 2 uniformed security officers now stood in the aisle before her, their presence a silent but undeniable threat. The older officer, a man in his late 50s with a shaved head and tired eyes, exhaled through his nose, glancing at the flight attendant as if he didn't want to be part of this. But it didn't matter what he wanted. He had been called, and now protocol had to be followed. "Ma'am," he said, his voice even, almost detached, "we need you to come with us." The silence in the cabin was suffocating. No one spoke. No one moved. The passengers sat frozen, torn between curiosity and the instinct to stay out of it. Harper swallowed, her throat tight. "And if I say no?" she asked, her voice steady but barely above a whisper. The younger officer, standing stiffly beside the first, shifted uncomfortably. He was newer, less practiced in these situations. There was a slight hesitation before he responded. "We really don't want to escalate this." Escalate. That word clawed at her chest. Escalate meant things could get worse. Escalate meant humiliation with force. She squeezed her hands into fists. "I paid for this seat. she said again, slower this time, as if repeating it would make them hear her differently. The older officer's expression didn't change. "Ma'am, we understand," he said, though his voice carried no real understanding. "But you've been asked to deplane." Harper turned to Shaq. He hadn't moved, but his presence was an anchor. He sat still, arms folded, his gaze locked on the officers. He hadn't spoken yet, not since they arrived. But his silence was a warning. The passengers weren't just watching Harper now. They were watching him. Shaq took a slow breath, then finally leaned forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the aisle. "She's not going anywhere," he said, his voice calm, but the weight behind it made the air shift. The older officer's jaw tightened. "Sir, we need to handle this situation properly." Shaq didn't blink. "Properly?" he repeated, his voice laced with something just shy of disbelief. "Throwing a woman off a plane because of how she looks? That's proper." A few passengers stirred, uneasy. Someone muttered a quiet agreement, though they didn't dare say it loud enough to be part of this moment. The flight attendant, still standing nearby, looked uncomfortable for the first time. Maybe she hadn't expected it to go this far. Maybe she thought Harper would back down before security was involved. But Harper wasn't moving, and Shaq wasn't letting it happen quietly. The younger officer glanced at his partner. A silent question passed between them. "What now?" The older officer sighed. He had been doing this job long enough to know when a situation was teetering on the edge of a bigger problem. But orders were orders. He turned back to Harper. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one last time. Please come with us voluntarily." Harper's chest tightened. Her fingers twitched at her sides. She wasn't going to win this. And the worst part? She knew it the second security was called. It was never a fair fight. She inhaled slow and deep, then unbuckled her seatbelt. The sound of the metal latch clicking open felt final, like a judge slamming a gavel. Shaq's hands tightened into fists against his knees. She stood. Her movements were controlled, careful, but her heart was raging. The officers didn't grab her, didn't touch her, didn't need to. She walked past them with her head high, her steps slow. But the humiliation was a living thing, clawing at her skin, digging into her ribs, pressing on her chest. Shaq watched as she moved toward the aisle, watched as she became the living consequence of injustice. And then, somewhere in the back of the plane, a soft chime. A phone recording. Someone was filming. It took only seconds for others to realize what was happening. The slight shift in the air, the barely perceptible clicks of camera apps opening, the way people who had been too scared to intervene were now suddenly brave behind their screens. Harper Sterling was about to go viral. As she reached the front of the cabin, her eyes flickered to Shaq one last time. And in that brief second, something passed between them. A silent understanding. She was walking away now. But this wasn't over. Then, she was gone. The security officers stepped out behind her. The flight attendant straightened her posture. And for a moment, the plane felt like it had been sucked into a vacuum of silence. Shaq sat stone still. The weight of what had just happened pressed against his chest, an ache that had nothing to do with himself, but with what he had just been forced to witness. Some passengers turned away, eager to pretend nothing had happened. Some kept watching, their faces twisted in quiet guilt. But Shaq? He made a decision. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. By the time the wheels touched the runway, the world had already changed. Shaq barely noticed the usual shuffle of passengers reaching for their bags, the impatient beeping of seatbelt signs turning off, or the robotic voice of the flight attendant thanking everyone for flying with them. None of it mattered anymore. Because outside the walls of this plane, a storm was brewing. The moment Harper had been escorted off the flight, the recording had spread like wildfire. The first video, shaky but clear enough to show exactly what had happened, had been uploaded just minutes after takeoff. By the time the flight landed, it was already trending. Justice for Harper. The tag appeared on Twitter first, then TikTok, then Instagram. It took less than an hour before major news outlets started picking up the story. A woman kicked off a plane for taking up too much space. An airline caught enforcing a policy that wasn't written, but was deeply understood. And Shaquille O'Neal, a silent witness who had spoken, but not yet acted. The video had everything to ignite a controversy. A woman being humiliated. A flight attendant with a carefully crafted smile that dripped with superiority. A security removal that looked eerily similar to 1,000 other incidents before it. Ones that never ended well. And then, the twist. Shaq, towering in his seat, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. She's not going anywhere. It was a single moment, but it was powerful. And now, the world was watching. The reaction was instantaneous and brutal. Social media exploded into two factions, those who were outraged and those who clung to the airline's excuse like a lifeline. On one side, "This is disgusting. Imagine paying for a seat and being humiliated like this." Shout out to Shaq for standing up. Most people would have just watched. This isn't about safety. This is about how society treats bigger bodies. On the other side, airlines have weight policies for a reason. If she didn't fit, that's on her. This isn't discrimination. It's logistics. Stop making everything about oppression. So now celebrities get to tell airlines how to do their jobs. But the most dangerous voices? They weren't in the comments. They were in the boardrooms. Corporate damage control kicked in immediately. Within hours, the airline released a generic, lawyer-approved statement. "We regret any discomfort our passengers experience while traveling. Our policies are designed to ensure safety and compliance with FAA regulations. We stand by our commitment to making air travel safe and accessible for all." It was classic corporate nonsense. A statement that said nothing at all. But the airline wasn't done yet. Instead of owning their mistake, they leaned into a different strategy: blame the rules. They claimed they had no choice. That the FAA required all passengers to fit within standard seating dimensions. That it wasn't about discrimination. It was about safety and fairness to all travelers. They didn't say Harper's name. They didn't acknowledge her experience. And that was their biggest mistake. Harper Sterling, from private citizen to public target. While corporate executives crafted carefully controlled messaging, Harper's entire world was unraveling. Her phone, which had been silent when she left the airport, wouldn't stop buzzing. Hundreds of missed calls, thousands of notifications. A social media account that had barely seen activity now flooded with messages, some supportive, some vile. Her email inbox was worse, reporters begging for interviews, TV networks offering exclusive features, people she had never met, dissecting her body, her life, her worth. She had been a school teacher yesterday. Today she was a symbol, and she wasn't sure she wanted to be. Shaq was back in his hotel room sitting on the edge of his bed, phone in his hands. The glow of the screen illuminated his face, but his expression was unreadable. He had seen public scandals before. He had lived through them, been at the center of them, watched them unfold from the sidelines. But this was different. He scrolled through video after video, watching the incident replay from a dozen different angles. The flight attendant's fake smile. Harper's shoulders tensing. Security stepping forward. And then his own voice. "She's not going anywhere." Shaq had stood up for her, but he hadn't stopped it, and that sat wrong with him. He knew how this story would go if it was left unchecked. The airline would bury it. They would let public outrage burn hot and fast, knowing that the internet always moves on. They would wait until something worse happened somewhere else. A bigger scandal, a more tragic injustice. And then Harper's name would fade. She would be left with the scars, while the airline moved forward unchanged. Shaq wasn't going to let that happen. The first move. He made a call. The voice on the other end answered immediately. "I was expecting you." Shaq's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. "I need you to find out who owns that airline." A pause. Then, "You thinking lawsuit?" Shaq exhaled through his nose. "I'm thinking bigger." Another pause. Then a slow whistle. "I'll call you back." The line went dead. Shaq set his phone down, staring at it for a long moment. The airline thought they were dealing with just another PR disaster. They didn't realize they had just made an enemy out of someone who could actually fight back. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just going to speak about this. He was about to do something. Grayson Caldwell sat in his private office on the 47th floor of a Manhattan high-rise, the skyline stretching behind him in a cold display of power. His desk was sleek, minimalistic, nothing out of place. A man like him didn't allow clutter, distractions, or failure. And yet, failure was exactly what he was staring at. The video played on the massive screen mounted to the wall. The resolution so crisp, he could see the subtle shift in the flight attendant's expression when she realized she had lost control of the situation. Caldwell had already seen the footage a dozen times, but he watched it again, his jaw tightening as the sequence unfolded. Harper Sterling, humiliated. Shaquille O'Neal, intervening at the worst possible moment. Security, making things even worse. And now? Justice. For Harper had reached 20 million views. His fingers tapped against the armrest of his leather chair, slow and rhythmic. To anyone else, it would seem like a simple tick. But those who knew Grayson Caldwell understood one thing. When he started tapping, he was already calculating how to destroy a problem. And right now, Harper Sterling was a problem. He exhaled through his nose, tapping the screen to pause the video just as Shaq's face filled the frame. This was the real problem. Not the woman, not the flight attendant, not even the social media outrage. That would have died down in days. But Shaquille O'Neal had changed the equation. A controversy could be managed. A celebrity-driven controversy? That was a PR nightmare with no expiration date. His assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Lydia Vaughn, stood near the door, a tablet in hand. She had been working for him for nearly a decade, which meant she was one of the few people who could stand in a room with him while he was furious and still keep her composure. She cleared her throat. "Sir, the board is concerned." Caldwell didn't look at her. His eyes stayed locked on the screen. "The board is always concerned. What else is new?" She shifted slightly but didn't falter. "This is different. The brand sentiment report is showing a 63% drop in positive engagement. Sponsors are making calls. Some of them want to know if we're handling this." Handling this. The phrase made Caldwell's lips curl in disdain. That was what he did. He handled things. Lydia hesitated, then added, "There's also the petition." That got his attention. His gaze finally flicked toward her, cold and sharp. "Petition?" She turned the tablet toward him. "A demand for policy reform. Over 500,000 signatures in the last 5 hours. It's gaining traction." Caldwell took the tablet, scrolling through the petition's page. His face remained unreadable, but internally he was seething. A petition meant this wouldn't just disappear. A petition meant public pressure. And public pressure meant the board would start sniffing around his office, demanding a solution. His eyes narrowed. He needed this gone. Now Caldwell set the tablet down and straightened in his chair. "Offer her money." Lydia didn't react. She had expected this. "How much?" she asked, already preparing to make the call. Caldwell exhaled, thinking. "Enough to make her disappear. Start at $50,000. If she pushes back, double it." Lydia tapped her screen, sending the request to legal. Money always worked. People thought they wanted justice, but what they really wanted was comfort, security, a way to move past the worst thing that had happened to them. Caldwell had used this tactic dozens of times. It always worked. He turned his attention back to Lydia. "And get me PR." Lydia nodded. "They've already drafted a second statement. A more direct apology." "Scrap it." She hesitated. "Sir?" His expression darkened. "We don't apologize. We control. I want a statement that redirects the focus. Find a way to make us the victim in this." Lydia hesitated again. "That might backfire." Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "Then make sure it doesn't." She nodded stiffly and left the office. Caldwell exhaled, leaning back in his chair, fingers steepling in front of him. The plan was already forming in his mind. Money would silence Harper. Media control would shift the narrative. And as for Shaq? He tapped his fingers against the desk again. Shaquille O'Neal thought he was a hero, but in Grayson Caldwell's world, heroes were nothing but obstacles. 3 hours later, Lydia returned. Her face was composed, but there was a tightness in her posture. Caldwell barely glanced at her. "Tell me it's handled." She swallowed. Harper Sterling refused the money. He froze. Slowly, he turned to face her fully. She what? Lydia exhaled. She said she doesn't want money. She wants accountability. For the first time in a very long time, Caldwell felt a crack in his control. People always took the money. Always. Double it, he said, his voice quieter now, more dangerous. Lydia's jaw tightened. We already did. She still refused. A long, sharp silence. Caldwell's mind raced. He had miscalculated. He had assumed Harper Sterling was like everyone else, someone who could be bought, convinced, worn down. But she wasn't backing down, and that meant his problem wasn't going away. His teeth clenched. If money wouldn't work, he needed another way. His voice was low, almost conversational, but Lydia recognized the shift in his tone. Fine, he said. If she wants a war, let's give her one. Lydia's posture stiffened. Sir, dig into her past, he said, ignoring her hesitation. Find something. Anything. A mistake, a financial issue, a workplace complaint. I want a story that makes this woman look like a fraud. Lydia hesitated. We don't have anything like that yet. Caldwell's gaze was cold. Then find it. Another pause. Then, reluctantly, she nodded. Understood. As she left the office, Caldwell leaned back again, staring at the paused video on the screen. This wasn't about right or wrong anymore. It was about power. And he never lost. While Caldwell set his plan into motion, he remained unaware of one crucial detail. Someone else had been making calls. Someone who wasn't backing down either. And as Caldwell plotted how to make Harper Sterling disappear, Shaquille O'Neal was about to make his first move. The war had only just begun. Grayson Caldwell had seen corporate crises before. He had weathered scandals, lawsuits, and public outcry. He knew the formula: deny, deflect, delay, and, if necessary, destroy. He thought he had control. What he didn't know was that his world was about to shift under his feet. Harper Sterling sat on her couch, phone in hand, her thumb hovering over the notification screen. It hadn't stopped buzzing in 3 days. Messages from strangers, journalists, news anchors, everyone wanted a piece of her. She had barely slept. The weight of the entire internet watching her had settled deep into her bones. And then, an unfamiliar number flashed across her screen. At first, she almost ignored it. Another reporter, another network, another person wanting her to talk before she even knew what to say. But something made her answer. A deep, familiar voice filled the line. Hey, Harper. It's Shaq. She froze. For a moment, she thought it was a joke, some kind of prank, but there was no mistaking that voice. The same voice that had cut through the tension on the plane, that had spoken up when no one else did. I know you've got people pulling you in 100 directions, he said, his tone calm, steady. I'm not calling for a headline, I just want to talk. Harper let out a slow breath, pressing her fingers to her temple. She should have expected this. Shaquille O'Neal was a global icon. He had influence, money, power. Everything that could turn a controversy like this into a movement. But he wasn't coming at her like a businessman. He was coming at her like a person. What do you want? She asked, too tired to dance around it. Shaq didn't hesitate. I want to help you tell your story, your way. Her chest tightened. She had spent the last few days drowning in other people's versions of what had happened. Reporters twisting her experience into sound bites. Online debates turning her body into a battleground. But her voice? That had been lost. What are you thinking? She asked cautiously. I've got a platform, Shaq said. More than that, I've got connections to the right people. I want to put you in front of the world, not on some clickbait segment, on a real stage. Harper swallowed. She already knew what he meant. National television, a live, unedited interview. She hesitated. I don't know if I can handle that. Shaq's voice was warm, unwavering. You already did the hard part, Harper. You stood your ground when it mattered. Now, all you have to do is tell the truth. A long silence stretched between them. Then softly. Okay. Grayson Caldwell was in a late-night board meeting when his phone vibrated. Normally he wouldn't check it. He had people to handle things like this. But when he saw the number, his stomach twisted. He excused himself, stepping into the hallway before answering. A sharp, clipped voice spoke on the other end. "Sir, we have a problem." Caldwell's patience was already wearing thin. "We've had a problem for days. What now?" A pause. Then, "Shaquille O'Neal just booked Harper Sterling for a live primetime interview." Caldwell stopped breathing for a full second. Live, unscripted, uncontrollable. His mind raced through possibilities. There was no way to prep for this. No PR team filtering her words, no legal loopholes to dodge. This was dangerous. Caldwell clenched his jaw, his voice lowering to a near growl. "Shut it down." The voice on the other end hesitated. "Sir, we don't have control over this. It's not our network." Caldwell's grip tightened on the phone. "Then find a way." "We do not let her speak." The call ended, but the unease in Caldwell's chest didn't fade. This was getting out of hand. And worse? He had a sinking feeling that Shaquille O'Neal wasn't done yet. The next morning, Caldwell walked into his office, still simmering with frustration. Lydia was waiting for him, her expression unreadable. But there was something different in her posture. Something that made his stomach knot. "What now?" he muttered, running a hand down his face. Lydia's lips twitched, just slightly. There was an overnight acquisition. Caldwell froze mid-step. "An acquisition?" His voice was sharp, dangerous. "Of what?" Lydia slid a folder across his desk, her eyes unreadable. Caldwell snatched it, flipping it open. The words on the page made his blood run cold. He blinked, reading it again, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Shaq had bought into the airline, not just a small stake, a controlling one. Caldwell's hands clenched into fists. How the hell did this happen? Lydia exhaled. "He's been making calls all week. He used his connections, worked through third parties. No one saw it coming." Caldwell slammed the folder shut, rage creeping into his voice. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just a celebrity protesting an airline. He was now one of its biggest shareholders, and that meant he didn't have to demand change. He could force it. Shaq's final message to Caldwell. Caldwell wasn't used to losing. But as he stared at the papers in front of him, reality hit him like a freight train. Shaq had played him. Perfectly. And then, his office phone buzzed. Lydia picked it up, listened for a second, then turned to Caldwell. "It's Shaquille O'Neal." Caldwell's stomach twisted, but he snatched the phone off the receiver, pressing it to his ear. Shaq's voice came through the line, calm, slow, and utterly in control. "Hey, Grayson, heard you had a rough morning." Caldwell's teeth clenched. "What do you want?" A chuckle. "See, that's the thing, I already got it." Silence stretched. Then Shaq's voice dropped lower, more serious. "We can do this two ways," he said. "You clean up your mess, you make this right. Or," a pause. "Or what?" Caldwell snapped. Shaq exhaled. "Or I burn your whole airline to the ground." Click. The call ended. And for the first time in his career, Grayson Caldwell had no moves left to play. Grayson Caldwell was not a man who lost. For decades, he had built an empire on power, control, and precision. Every crisis had a solution, every obstacle had a price, and every scandal could be buried before it did real damage. But today, for the first time in his career, he was walking into a battle he had already lost. The press conference had been Shaq's idea. Caldwell hadn't wanted it. He had fought it, tried to negotiate, tried to stall. But once Shaquille O'Neal became one of Skyline Airlines' largest shareholders, the game changed. Shaq didn't need permission. He didn't need Caldwell's approval. He had forced his hand. Now, the world was watching. The conference room was packed. Journalists, photographers, cameras live streaming the event across every major news network. A long table sat at the front, microphones lined up, the company's corporate logo displayed proudly on the backdrop. At the center of the table sat Caldwell, his jaw tight, his suit perfect, but his confidence shaken. To his right sat Shaquille O'Neal, calm, composed, his massive frame impossible to ignore. His presence alone commanded the room. And then, on Shaq's other side, was Harper Sterling. Just days ago, she had been humiliated, removed from a flight like she didn't belong. Today, she sat tall, unshaken, unafraid. The room buzzed with tension. Everyone knew what this was. A reckoning. Caldwell leaned forward, clearing his throat. The microphone carried his voice across the room, but it felt small compared to the weight of what was about to happen. "We at Skyline Airlines," he began, measured, calculated, "would like to express our deepest regrets over the recent events involving one of our passengers, Ms. Sterling." He turned slightly, glancing at Harper for the briefest moment before continuing. "Our airline has always prided itself on inclusivity and fairness, and we recognize that the way the situation was handled did not reflect those values. It was the perfect corporate apology, apologizing without truly admitting fault." The journalists scribbled notes, cameras flashed, and for a moment it seemed like Caldwell might get away with it. Until Shaq spoke. "That's not good enough," Shaq said, leaning into the mic. His voice wasn't raised, but it commanded absolute attention. Caldwell stiffened, his fingers curling slightly on the table. Shaq turned to face the cameras, his gaze steady, unwavering. "An apology means nothing if nothing changes." The room went silent. Caldwell shifted uncomfortably, but Shaq didn't look at him. He was speaking to the people watching at home. "This isn't just about one flight," Shaq continued. "It's about a system that makes people feel like they don't belong, like they're an inconvenience, like their bodies don't fit into what the world decides is acceptable." His words cut through the air like a blade. Harper swallowed, her hands folded in her lap, but Shaq could see it. The way her shoulders straightened, the way her chest rose just slightly with a deep breath. Because this time she wasn't fighting alone. Shaq turned to Caldwell, his tone now firm. "I'm not here for an apology. I'm here for action." Caldwell's jaw tightened. "What exactly do you propose?" Shaq didn't hesitate. "New policies," he said, "effective immediately." Caldwell exhaled sharply. "We can't." Shaq cut him off. "You can, and you will." A murmur rippled through the journalists. This wasn't a press conference anymore. This was a corporate takedown. Shaq's voice was unwavering. "Starting today, Skyline Airlines will implement new seating accommodations for larger passengers, without extra charges. No more forced removals, no more humiliation." Caldwell stiffened. Shaq wasn't suggesting change. He was demanding it. And the worst part? Caldwell couldn't say no. Not with the cameras rolling, not with the entire world watching. The pressure was too great. The board had already warned him. Skyline Airlines couldn't afford another PR disaster. Caldwell's nostrils flared, his fingers gripping the table's edge. He was trapped. His eyes flickered to the journalists, then to Harper, then finally back to Shaq. And he knew. He had lost. With no other choice, Caldwell slowly leaned forward, adjusting his tie. His next words tasted like ash in his mouth. "Skyline Airlines will be revising its policies," he said, his voice controlled but stripped of its usual power. "Effective immediately, all passengers, regardless of size, will be treated with dignity and respect." There it was. A victory. The journalists exploded with questions, cameras flashing, voices overlapping as they rushed to document the moment. Harper blinked, as if trying to process that this was really happening. She turned to Shaq, and for the first time in days, she smiled. Not just because of the policies, not just because of the win, but because she had been heard. The press conference footage went viral within minutes. Major news outlets ran the headline: "Shaquille O'Neal forces Major Airline to change discriminatory policies." Social media erupted in celebration. "This is how you use power the right way. Shaq just changed the airline industry forever." Harper Sterling stood her ground. Shaq made sure it mattered. Skyline Airlines, once dismissive, now had no choice but to embrace the change. New policies were rolled out. Other airlines took notice. Discussions began about making air travel more inclusive across the industry. A single moment had reshaped everything. Later that evening, as the world celebrated, Shaq sat in a quiet corner of a rooftop bar, watching the city lights flicker below. Harper sat beside him, still overwhelmed but finally at peace. She looked over at him. "Why did you do this?" Shaq didn't answer right away. He took a sip of his drink, letting the moment settle before finally saying, "Because it was the right thing to do." Harper exhaled, shaking her head. "I don't think I'll ever be able to thank you enough." Shaq turned to her, his expression soft but steady. "You don't have to." A pause. Then with a small smile, "You just have to take your next flight knowing you belong." The world had moved fast, faster than Harper Sterling ever imagined. What had started as one humiliating moment on a flight had turned into something much bigger, something that had forced an entire industry to look at itself in the mirror. And for the first time in history, the reflection wasn't ignored. Skyline Airlines had no choice but to follow through on the promises made at the press conference. The policies that had once been whispers in corporate meetings were now headline news, and failure to implement them would mean the company's collapse. Within weeks, the airline rolled out new size-inclusive seating options. Seats with adjustable armrests and extra width were introduced. Passengers who required additional space were given the option to request accommodations without extra charges. Flight attendant training programs were revamped to eliminate discrimination and bias. And just like that, an industry-wide conversation had begun. Other airlines took notice. Some pushed back, but others followed, quietly implementing their own changes before they could become the next Skyline Airlines. What had once been policy was now a symbol of the past. A past that Harper Sterling had refused to accept. Shaquille O'Neal had done more than just speak up. When he had acquired a stake in Skyline Airlines, he hadn't done it for profit. He had done it for leverage. And now that change was secured, he had no reason to keep it. So he donated every penny of his earnings from the stock. Millions of dollars, money that had come from a system that had once excluded people like Harper, was now being used to fight against it. The funds were distributed to organizations working on body discrimination, airline accessibility, and passenger rights. One donation in particular went toward a new program that would provide discounted flights for plus-size travelers who had been overcharged in the past. Shaq never made a big announcement about it. He didn't need to. The impact spoke for itself. Harper never wanted to be famous. She had never asked to be the face of a movement, but some stories weren't chosen. They were thrust upon you. And what mattered was what you did with them. Though the chaos eventually died down, Harper's name remained. She was invited to speak at conferences, to join advocacy groups, to keep fighting for fairness in travel. But at the end of it all, she still chose to return to what she loved most: teaching. Her students looked at her differently now, not just as a teacher, but as a lesson in resilience. A living reminder that sometimes standing your ground can change the world. Months later, Shaq boarded another plane. Same airline, different world. As he walked through first class, he noticed something different. The seats, wider, more comfortable, more accommodating. He didn't need to ask if the policy had been fully implemented. The evidence was right in front of him. As he reached his seat, he glanced across the aisle and saw a plus-sized woman settling in. There was no hesitation in her movements, no nervous glances toward the flight attendants, no fear of being told she didn't belong. Shaq smiled to himself, leaning back in his seat. This time, no one was getting kicked off for being too big. Justice had been served, and a legacy had been created. What would you do if you saw injustice happening right in front of you? Would you stay silent or change the story? This wasn't just about one woman on a plane. It's about who gets to belong. The next time someone tries to rewrite the rules of fairness, make sure you have the pen. The fight isn't over. So tell us, what's the next story the world needs to hear?